Good morning, students. Welcome to the class of literary terms. In today's class, we are going to discuss two literary terms. The first is dramatic monologue and the second is short story. Let me first explain you what is a dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue designates a type of poem that was perfected by Robert Browning. In its complete form, as represented in Browning's My Last Duchess, The Bishop Orders His Tomb, Andrea del Sarto, and many other poems, the dramatic monologue has the following characteristics. First, a single person who is not the poet himself utters the entire poem in a specific situation at a critical moment. The Duke is negotiating with an emissary for a second wife. The bishop lies dying. Andrea once more attempts wistfully to believe his wife's lies. Second characteristic is, this person addresses and interacts with one or more other people, but we know of the auditor's presence and what they say and do only from clues in the discourse of the single speaker. The third characteristic, the monologue is so organized that its focus is on the temperament and character that the dramatic speaker unintentionally reveals in the course of what he says. Even Browning in monologues such as Soliloquy of the Spanish Cloister and Caliban upon Satyrbos omits the second attribute, that is, the presence of a silent auditor, but attributes 1 and 3 as essential distinctions between the dramatic monologue and the dramatic lyric. Thus we see John Donne's The Canonization and The Flea, although very close to the dramatic monologue, lack one essential feature, that is, the focus of interest is on the speaker's elaborately ingenious argument rather than on the character he inadvertently reveals in the course of arguing. And although Wordsworth's Tintin Abbey is spoken by one person to a silent auditor, that is his sister, in a specific situation at a significant moment in his life, it is not properly a dramatic monologue, both because we are invited to identify the speaker with the poem himself, and because the organizing principle is not the revelation of the speaker's distinctive temperament, but the evolution of his observation, thought, memory, and feelings. Finally, we can say Tennyson wrote Ulysses and other dramatic monologues, and the form has been used by Robert Frost, E. A. Robinson, Ezra Pound, Robert Lowell, and other poets of the century. The best known modern instance is T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So students, this much about dramatic monologue, and when you read the poem Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, you will come to know exactly what a dramatic monologue is. Once the poem is discussed in the class, we can take the dramatic monologue, linking the dramatic monologue and the poem so that the understanding is much better. Now let us come to the second literary term, that is short story. What is a short story? A short story is a work of prose fiction, and most of the terms for analyzing the component parts, the types, and the various narrative techniques of the novel are applicable to the short story as well. It differs, for example, from the anecdote, the simple and unelaborated narration of a single incident, in that it organizes the action, thought, and interaction of his characters into the artful pattern of a plot which has a beginning and develops through a middle to some sort of denouncement at the end. The plot form may be comic or tragic or romantic or satiric. The story is presented to us from one of the many available points of view, and it may be written in the mode of fantasy, realism, or naturalism. So, after this first paragraph, we can know what a short story is. We can just say that it is a work of fiction which has a plot which, according to Aristotle's definition, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There can be various kinds of plot. The plot can be comic or comedy. It can be tragic or tragedy, or romantic or satiric. Further, we can say that in the tale or story of incident, the focus of interest is on the course and outcomes of the events, as in Poe's The Gold Bug or other tales of detection. In the stories of O. Henry and in the stock but sometimes well-contrived Western story in the pulp magazines, stories of character focus on the revelation of a state of mind and motivation or of moral qualities. In some of the stories of character by the Russian master of the form Chekhov, nothing more happens than an encounter and conversation between two people. Ernest Hemingway's classic A Clean, Well-Lighted Place consists only of a curt conversation between two waiters about an old man who each day gets drunk and stays on in the cafe until it closes, followed by a brief meditation on the part of one of the waiters. Some stories achieve a balance of interest between external action and character. We can further say that the short story, however, is a story that is short, that is, it differs from the novel in the dimension which Aristotle calls magnitude. And this limitation imposes differences both in the efforts that can be achieved and in the choice and management of the elements to achieve those effects. Edgar Allan Poe, who is sometimes called the originator of the short story as a specific genre, was at any rate its first critical theorist. He defined what he called the prose tale as a narrative that can be read at one sitting or for half an hour to 2 hours, and that is limited to a certain unique or single effect, to which every detail is subordinate. Poe's comment applies to many short stories and its point to the economy of management, which the tightness of the form always imposes in some degree. We can, however, say that by and large, the short story writer introduces a very limited number of characters, cannot afford the space for a leisurely analysis and sustained development of character, and cannot undertake to develop as dense and detailed a social milieu as does the novelist. He often begins his story close to or even on the verge of the climax, minimizes both prior exposition and the details of the settings, keeps the complications down, and clears up the denouncement quickly, sometimes even in a few sentences. The central incident is selected to reveal as much as possible of the totality of the protagonist's life and character, and the details are devised to carry maximum significance. This spareness in the narrative means often given the artistry in a good short story higher visibility than the artistry in an equally good novel. In the end, we can say many distinguished short stories, however, depart from the paradigm in various ways. It must be remembered that the name covers a great diversity of prose fiction, all the way from the short story, which is a slightly elaborated anecdote of perhaps 500 words, to such long and complex forms as Melville's Billy Budd, Henry James' The Turn of the Screw, and Conrad's Heart of Darkness, whose status between the tautness of the short story and the expansiveness of the novel is sometimes indicated by the same novelette. Historically, the short narrative in both prose and verse is one of the oldest and most widespread of literary forms. Some of the types which preceded the short story are the fable, the exemplum, like the folk tale, and the fabula. The form of prose narrative, recognizably like the contemporary short story, was developed by such writers as Washington Irving, Hawthorne and Poe in America, Sir Walter Scott in England, E.T.A. Hoffmann in Germany, Balzac in France, and Gogol and Turgenev in Russia. The short story in English has flourished more in America than in England. Frank O'Connor has called it the national art form, and in American masters include, in addition to those already mentioned, William Faulkner, Catherine Anne Porter, Audra Weltry, Flannery O'Connor, John O'Hara, J.F. Paz, John Cheever, and J.D. Salinger. So this was for the class today. In this class, we have discussed two more literary terms other than the essay and the novel that we have discussed in our previous classes. Today we have taken dramatic monologue and short story. In tomorrow's class, we will be taking up another two literary terms. Thank you, students.